"Mom, you're too old to lead this company anymore." That was what my son said to me in a room I had paid for, inside a building I had helped design. Sitting at the head of a 12-foot walnut conference table I chose myself 23 years ago. No one else spoke after that. The air conditioner hummed softly above us, steady and indifferent, while 8 pairs of eyes shifted between me and Ethan as if they were watching a quiet transfer of power. Claire sat to his right, perfectly composed in her cream blazer, her hands folded neatly over a leather portfolio that used to be mine. I noticed she didn't look surprised. I suppose she shouldn't have been. This had been building for months. I folded my reading glasses slowly and placed them on the table. "If you believe that's best," I said, my voice even, the way it had always been in moments that required steadiness. Ethan cleared his throat. "It's not personal, Mom. We just need new energy. Faster decisions. Faster." The word lingered in the room like something sharp but polished. I nodded once. I had been making decisions for this company since before he learned how to balance a checkbook. When my husband, Robert, died of a heart attack at 58, the board expected me to sell. They sent sympathy flowers and quiet offers from competitors who assumed I would fold under pressure. Instead, I came into this very office the following Monday at 7:30 a.m., poured myself a cup of burnt breakroom coffee, and started calling clients one by one. I worked 14-hour days for the next 3 years. I renegotiated supplier contracts during the 2008 recession when banks were tightening every line of credit. I sat across from investors who looked at my silver hair and asked if there was someone else they should speak to. There wasn't. There was only me. And the company survived. It grew. It became something my son could inherit. But in the last year, I began noticing small shifts. Meetings scheduled without me. Strategy memos forwarded after decisions had already been made. Claire referring to me as our founder instead of our CEO. The words sounded ceremonial, distant, like something etched on a plaque. I understood what they were doing long before today. I just waited to see if Ethan would have the courage to say it. Out loud. Now he had. "We think it's time you enjoy retirement," Claire added gently, as if she were recommending a vacation package. I looked around the table again. Mark from finance avoided my eyes. Daniel, who had been with us for 15 years, stared down at his legal pad. I could almost hear the calculations running behind their silence. Risk, stability, loyalty. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. My knees did not shake. My hands did not tremble. "Then I'll step aside," I said. The words surprised even Ethan. I saw it in the way his posture shifted, as though he had prepared for resistance and found none. I gathered the slim folder in front of me, though there was nothing inside it I truly needed. "You'll have my resignation by the end of the week." Claire's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "We appreciate everything you've done." Everything. Past tense. I walked out of that conference room without looking back. The hallway felt longer than usual, the framed awards lining the walls catching the afternoon light. My name was engraved on nearly all of them. I paused only once, to straighten a photograph of Robert and me at the groundbreaking ceremony. Both of us squinting into the sun, hard hats on, hopeful. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel humiliation. What I felt was something colder and far more clarifying. They believed leadership was a title, a chair at the head of a table, a signature on a memo. They believed age meant decline, that experience could be replaced by speed. So I gave them what they wanted. I stepped aside, and that was when they would begin to notice what I had really been holding together all along. I woke up the next morning at 5:30, the same time I had woken up for the past 25 years, even though there was nowhere I needed to be. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. I stood at the window with a cup of black coffee and watched the sun rise over the maple trees in my backyard, the light spreading slowly across the lawn Robert used to mow every Saturday, without fail. For the first time in decades, my schedule was empty. No board calls. No performance reviews. No supplier negotiations. I had sent my resignation letter at 8:15 the previous evening, concise and polite, thanking the board for their trust over the years and expressing confidence in the new leadership. Ethan responded within 10 minutes. His message was brief. He said he respected my decision and hoped I would enjoy a well-deserved rest. Claire sent a separate email 20 minutes later. She wrote that transitions are never easy, but that change is healthy for growth. I read both messages twice and then archived them without replying. By 9 o'clock, My phone had begun to vibrate steadily on the kitchen counter. Mark from finance left a voicemail asking about the status of a long-term vendor agreement. Daniel sent a text asking where certain historical documents were stored. I did not respond. I had stepped aside. That was what they wanted. At 10:30, I drove downtown out of habit, turning into the parking garage before I realized there was no reason to swipe my access card. I paused at the entrance, watching employees file in with coffee cups and leather bags, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. I reversed slowly and drove instead to the small community library 3 blocks away. I had not visited in years. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. I sat at a wooden table near the window and opened a notebook I had not used since Robert passed. For years, I had carried the company in my head. Client histories, contract clauses, investor preferences. I had been the quiet bridge between departments that did not always trust one another. I had known which supplier would bend during a difficult quarter and which would not. I had known which employee was capable of more than their title suggested and which one needed firm direction. Leadership had never been about speed. It had been about memory, about context, about understanding the weight of decisions before making them. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, an email notification appeared from one of our largest investors. The subject line read urgent. I closed the screen without opening it. If they believed I was slowing things down, then they would have to discover what it felt like to move without the history I carried. I finished my coffee and watched dust particles drift through the sunlight on the library table. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel the pressure of being needed. I felt the space left behind when something steady is removed. And I wondered how long it would take before they felt it too. 3 days passed before the first crack appeared. I did not hear it directly from Ethan. I heard it from Daniel. He showed up at my front door on a Thursday afternoon, still wearing his navy suit, his tie slightly loosened as if the day had pressed harder on him than usual. I opened the door and studied his expression before saying anything. He looked the way people look when they realize something important too late. I hope I am not overstepping, he said carefully. I just thought you should know that the Hamilton account is reconsidering their renewal. I invited him inside and poured 2 glasses of iced tea. I did not ask for details immediately. I let him sit. I let him feel the quiet of a house that no longer revolved around conference calls and quarterly projections. After a moment, he continued. The new strategy presentation Claire led on Monday had promised aggressive expansion into markets we had studied for years and deliberately avoided. The margins looked impressive on paper. The risks were not discussed. Hamilton had been with us for 11 years. They valued stability more than bold promises. I knew that because I had spent 6 months earning their trust after a previous supplier failed them. Daniel stared at the condensation sliding down his glass. They asked why you were not in the room, he said. I nodded once. And what did Ethan say? Daniel hesitated. He said you were enjoying retirement. The words sounded thin. I thanked Daniel for coming and walked him to the door. I did not call Hamilton. I did not call Ethan. I returned to my desk at home and opened the leather binder where I kept copies of every major contract signed in the last 2 decades. Not because I planned to intervene, because I wanted to remember. Each agreement carried a story, a concession offered at the right moment, a clause adjusted after a long dinner conversation. Leadership had never been about standing at the front of a room. It had been about knowing what could not be seen on a spreadsheet. On Friday morning, the investor whose email I had ignored earlier in the week called again. This time he left a voicemail. His tone was polite but strained. He said the board was requesting an emergency review of the new expansion plan and would appreciate my perspective if I were willing. I listened to the message twice and then placed my phone face down on the table. I had given them exactly what they requested. Space, autonomy, speed. By Sunday evening, word had spread quietly through former colleagues who still respected me enough to keep in touch. 2 senior managers were considering offers elsewhere. A supplier had delayed shipment pending clarification on revised payment terms Claire had proposed. None of these issues were catastrophic on their own, but I understood patterns. Small fractures, left unattended, travel quickly through a structure. Late that night, my phone lit up with Ethan's name. I watched it ring. I imagined him in his office, sleeves rolled up, the confidence from Monday thinning with each new complication. I did not answer. A moment later, a text appeared. He wrote that he hoped we could talk soon. I set the phone aside and turned off the lamp beside my bed. In the darkness, I felt no triumph. Only confirmation. They believed removing me would create room for progress. What it created instead was a silence where judgment used to be. And silence, in business, is rarely harmless. He came to see me on Monday evening, not as a chief executive officer, but as my son. I knew that before I opened the door because Ethan never knocked twice. This time he did. I found him standing on the porch with his jacket folded over his arm, his expression tight in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager waiting to admit he had made a mistake. I stepped aside and let him in without a word. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and the pot roast I had cooked earlier that afternoon, out of habit more than hunger. He sat at the kitchen table where he used to do his homework, long before titles and board votes complicated our relationship. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He stared at the wood grain as if searching for the right sentence inside it. Hamilton is pulling back, he said finally. They have not terminated the contract yet, but they are delaying the renewal. I nodded slowly. And the board? I asked. He exhaled. They want a revised plan. They are nervous about the expansion numbers. There it was. Not panic. Not disaster. Just instability. The kind that grows quietly if it is not addressed with care. I poured him a glass of water and placed it in front of him. You knew Hamilton valued consistency, I said evenly. They built their projections around steady growth, not dramatic swings. He looked up at me then, frustration flickering behind his eyes. We cannot keep doing things the old way forever. I studied his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper than they were a year ago. There is a difference between evolving and abandoning what works, I replied. He leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. Claire believes the market is shifting faster than we expected. I noticed he said Claire believes, not I believe. The distinction was small but important. And what do you believe? I asked. Silence settled between us again, heavier this time. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, headlights sweeping across the front windows before disappearing. I believe we might have moved too quickly, he admitted. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, like a language he was still learning to speak. I did not rush to fill the quiet that followed. I let him sit with that recognition. After a moment, he continued. The investor group is asking questions about leadership continuity. They want reassurance. I almost smiled at the phrasing. Leadership continuity. That was the polite way of saying they were uncertain. You told them I was enjoying retirement, I said calmly. He shifted in his seat. That seemed easier than explaining everything. Easier. I folded my hands on the table. Ethan, when you remove the person who has held the relationships together for 2 decades, you cannot be surprised when those relationships hesitate. He did not argue. He did not defend Claire this time. Instead, he looked around the kitchen, at the familiar cabinets, the framed family photographs, the quiet steadiness of a home that had not changed with the market. What would you do? He asked softly. It was the first time he had asked that question since the meeting. I held his gaze for several seconds before answering. If I were still in that chair, I would call Hamilton personally. I would acknowledge their concerns without dismissing the new strategy entirely. I would adjust the timeline, not the vision. And I would remind the board why they trusted us in the first place. He listened carefully, absorbing each word. I could see the calculation returning to his posture, the instinct to regain control. But I did not offer to make those calls. I did not volunteer to step back into the role he had so confidently taken. I had stepped aside. That was the choice he made possible. Whether he understood it yet or not, leadership was never about occupying a seat. It was about earning the quiet confidence of the people who depended on you. And that confidence does not transfer automatically just because a vote has been taken. After Ethan left that night, I did not sit in the quiet and replay every word. I washed his glass, dried it carefully, and returned it to the cabinet as if restoring order to something small and manageable. The next morning, I woke again at 5:30. Habit does not disappear simply because a title does. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me, not to draft plans for the company, but to think clearly without interruption. By 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a calendar invitation forwarded from the board. It was for an emergency meeting scheduled that afternoon. I was not listed as an attendee. That, more than anything, confirmed the reality of my new position. Outside the structure, watching from a distance. Around 9:15, Daniel called again. His voice was measured, but I could hear the strain beneath it. He said the Hamilton representative had requested written clarification about the expansion timeline and wanted assurance that leadership remained stable. He paused before adding that Claire had responded with a detailed projection model, but had not addressed the relationship concerns directly. I thanked him for the information and wished him a steady day. I did not offer guidance. If Ethan wanted to lead, he would have to navigate the weight of those conversations himself. Late that afternoon, Claire sent a message to the executive team, which I received only because I was still copied on. An outdated distribution list. She wrote about innovation, bold direction, and the necessity of embracing change. She quoted market data and growth forecasts. What she did not mention was trust. She did not mention continuity. She did not mention the quiet reassurance clients seek when the market feels uncertain. That evening, Ethan called again. This time I answered. He sounded tired, not defeated, but aware that confidence alone was not solving the problem. The board wants you to attend the next meeting, he said. Not as chief executive officer, just as a consultant. I let the word settle. Consultant. It was a careful compromise, designed to preserve his authority while borrowing my credibility. Why? I asked calmly. There was a brief silence before he replied. Because they feel more comfortable when you are in the room. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in frustration, but in recognition. Comfort is not a trivial thing in business. It is currency. And Claire? I asked. He hesitated. She thinks it might undermine the transition. Of course she did. I pictured her at the conference table, posture straight, voice steady, determined to prove that momentum could replace memory. Ethan, I said evenly, if your leadership is solid, my presence will not weaken it. If it is fragile, that is not something my absence can fix. He did not respond immediately. I imagined him standing in his office, staring out at the skyline, weighing pride against practicality. Finally he spoke. Will you come? I looked around my kitchen, at the familiar cabinets, the framed photographs, the life that existed beyond quarterly earnings. I had stepped aside because they believed I was slowing them down. Now they were asking for steadiness. I will attend, I said, but I will not reclaim what I have already released. He exhaled softly, a mixture of relief and uncertainty. After we ended the call, I remained seated at the table for several minutes. I was not returning to rescue them. I was returning to observe. Leadership, I had learned long ago, is most visible when it is missing. And the board, the investors, even my own son, were beginning to understand that absence has a weight of its own. The board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because punctuality has always been a form of quiet discipline. The receptionist greeted me with a flicker of surprise that she quickly masked with a polite smile. My access card no longer worked, so she printed a temporary badge with the word consultant beneath my name. I pinned it to my blazer without comment. When I stepped into the conference room, conversations paused for half a second before resuming in softer tones. Ethan stood near the head of the table. Claire was beside him, tablet in hand, her posture composed. The chair at the head of the table remained occupied by my son. I chose a seat along the side, equidistant from the investors and the executive team. I did not bring a laptop, only a leather folder and a pen. The meeting began with numbers, revenue projections, revised timelines, charts illustrating potential expansion into 3 additional states over the next 18 months. Claire spoke with confidence, her voice steady as she explained how short-term volatility could lead to long-term gains. When she finished, one of the senior investors leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He did not address Claire. He looked at me. Margaret, he said, from your experience, how would you assess the risk exposure of this pace? The room grew still. I noticed Ethan's jaw tighten slightly. I did not rush my answer. Growth is not the concern, I said calmly. The sequence is. I explained that expanding into unfamiliar markets while renegotiating core contracts introduced simultaneous uncertainty. I pointed out that Hamilton had historically prioritized predictable service continuity over rapid scale. I did not criticize Claire's projections. I simply placed them within context. Another board member asked whether a phased rollout might preserve investor confidence while testing the new strategy in a single region first. Ethan responded before I could. He acknowledged that the original timeline might have been ambitious. It was the first public adjustment he had made since taking control. I watched him carefully. There was no collapse, no dramatic reversal, only a subtle recalibration, the kind that signals learning. Claire interjected once, suggesting that hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. I turned to her with a measured expression. Deliberation is not weakness, I said evenly. It is respect for complexity. No one argued. The conversation shifted. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to implement a revised plan. One new market over 12 months, with quarterly performance reviews before any additional expansion. It was not my strategy. It was a compromise shaped by experience. As the meeting adjourned, several investors approached me quietly to express appreciation for my perspective. Ethan remained near his chair, thanking members as they exited. Claire gathered her tablet and documents with controlled precision. When the room finally emptied, Ethan looked at me across the table. There was something different in his expression now. Not resentment, not defiance, something closer to recognition. I stood and placed my pen back inside my folder. You handled the adjustment well, I said simply. He nodded once, absorbing the comment. I did not linger. I did not reclaim the head of the table. I walked out with the same steady pace I had used when I left weeks earlier. Leadership does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself in the space between impulse and decision. And that afternoon, everyone in that room felt the difference between speed and steadiness. In the days that followed the board meeting, something subtle shifted in the office, and I could sense it even from a distance. I did not need to be copied on every email to understand the atmosphere. People who had once hesitated to contact me began reaching out again, not to undermine Ethan, but to recalibrate themselves. On Friday morning, I received a call from Hamilton's senior representative, Mr. Lawson. His voice was calm, professional, but warmer than it had been the previous week. He thanked me for attending the board session and said the revised timeline demonstrated prudence. He emphasized that their company valued long-term partnerships over aggressive expansion. I listened carefully, offering no promises, only acknowledgement. I told him that stability would remain a priority. I chose my words with precision. I did not say I was back. I did not say I was in charge. I spoke as someone who understood the foundation beneath the numbers. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by my house again, this time without the tightness in his shoulders. He sat across from me at the dining table, sunlight cutting across the polished surface between us. Hamilton is staying, he said quietly. They agreed to renew under the adjusted plan. I inclined my head slightly. That is good news. He studied me for a moment, as if expecting celebration or correction. I offered neither. The board seems calmer, he continued. They feel reassured. I folded my hands. Confidence returns when uncertainty is addressed directly, I said, not avoided. He nodded. There was less defensiveness in him now, less urgency to prove something. Claire thinks the board is becoming too cautious, he admitted. She believes we should push forward while the market window is open. I considered this carefully before responding. Ambition is valuable, I said evenly. But timing determines whether ambition becomes success or regret. He did not argue. Instead, he asked something he had not asked before. Did you ever feel unsure? The question lingered in the air between us. I allowed myself a small, reflective breath. Every quarter, I answered honestly. But I never let uncertainty dictate speed. I let it sharpen judgment. He leaned back in his chair, absorbing that distinction. In that moment, I saw not the chief executive officer, not the board appointee, but my son, a man navigating pressure he had once believed would feel lighter in his own hands. As evening settled outside the windows, I realized something important. I was no longer being viewed as an obstacle to progress. I was becoming something else entirely. A reference point, a measure. The investors had seen the contrast between rapid change and considered adjustment. The employees had noticed who understood the history behind each partnership. Even Claire, though she would never admit it openly, had begun to temper her tone in meetings. I did not reclaim authority. I did not demand recognition. I simply remained steady. And steadiness, when compared to volatility, becomes unmistakable. By the end of the week, Ethan called to inform me that the board had formally requested my presence at future quarterly reviews, not as a temporary consultant, but as a permanent strategic advisor. I thanked him without enthusiasm or reluctance. Titles mattered less to me now than clarity. What mattered was that everyone in that building had begun to see what had always been there. Leadership is not about occupying the front of the room. It is about anchoring it. And once an anchor is removed, the drifting becomes impossible to ignore. The following quarter moved more slowly, and that was intentional. Expansion into the first new state began with measured steps rather than grand announcements. Ethan held smaller meetings, asking more questions than he had before. I attended the quarterly review as requested, seated once again along the side of the table, my role clearly defined, yet quietly influential. The atmosphere in the room felt different from the urgency that had filled it weeks earlier. There was less tension in the way executives presented updates. Fewer sweeping claims. More acknowledgement of variables. Claire still led the strategic discussions, her tone polished and confident, but I noticed she paused more often to invite input. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible to someone unfamiliar with her cadence. But I recognized it. During one segment of the meeting, a regional manager expressed concern about staffing shortages in the new market. Instead of dismissing the issue as temporary, Ethan leaned forward and asked for specifics. How many hires were pending? What training timeline was realistic? What contingency plans were in place? I watched him absorb the information without reacting defensively. The board members exchanged glances that carried a quiet approval. Leadership, I had learned, is strengthened when it listens publicly. After the meeting concluded, Claire approached me near the doorway. Her expression was composed, though her eyes revealed calculation. I appreciate your perspective in there, she said. The board responds well to your experience. I held her gaze steadily. Experience is only useful if it is applied, I replied calmly. She nodded once, perhaps recognizing that influence does not need to be loud to be present. Over the next several weeks, reports from the new market showed gradual but stable growth. Not explosive, not dramatic, just consistent. Hamilton renewed their contract formally, adding a clause for annual strategic reviews. Investor confidence steadied. Internally, employee turnover slowed. The atmosphere in the building shifted from uncertainty to cautious optimism. Ethan began stopping by my house not only when challenges arose, but occasionally to discuss broader ideas. He spoke less about proving himself and more about building something sustainable. I listened carefully, offering guidance without directing outcomes. I did not reclaim authority because authority had never been my goal. Stability was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees outside my kitchen window, Ethan admitted something quietly. When I asked you to step aside, I thought I was protecting the company from stagnation, he said. I did not realize how much weight you were carrying. I studied him for a long moment before responding. Weight is not visible when it is evenly distributed, I said. It is only noticeable when it disappears. He absorbed that without argument. The company was not collapsing. It was not dramatically transformed. It was stabilizing. And in that stabilization, something deeper had shifted. The board no longer saw me as a relic of the past. They saw me as a reference point for judgment. Ethan no longer viewed my presence as competition. He began to understand it as reinforcement. Claire, ambitious and intelligent, adjusted her pace to align with reality rather than momentum alone. I remained where I was, neither advancing nor retreating. Leadership had changed shape, but it had not lost its foundation. And sometimes, the most powerful position is not at the head of the table, but in the quiet space where perspective steadies ambition. 6 months later, I stood once again in the conference room, not to reclaim anything, but to witness something earned. The first new market had exceeded conservative projections by 3%, not because we rushed, but because we listened. Hamilton had extended their agreement by 2 additional years. Employee retention had improved. The atmosphere in the office felt steady, grounded, purposeful. Ethan now opened meetings with acknowledgement instead of assertion. He invited department heads to speak before presenting conclusions. He asked questions that revealed thought rather than urgency. I watched him carefully, not as a critic, but as a mother who understood the difference between authority claimed and authority developed. Claire had adjusted as well. Her presentations were still polished, still ambitious, but no longer dismissive of caution. She referenced historical data more frequently. She paused to consider implications beyond quarterly targets. It was not a surrender of vision. It was refinement. After one particularly smooth quarterly review, the board chair approached me privately. He thanked me for remaining involved and admitted that the transition had revealed how much institutional memory matters. I responded simply that memory is only useful when it guides the future rather than clinging to the past. Later that evening, Ethan joined me at my home for dinner. The tension that once followed him through the door had dissolved. He spoke openly about the balance he was learning to maintain between innovation and preservation. At one point, he set his fork down and looked at me directly. "I thought stepping into your position meant stepping ahead of you," he said. "I did not understand that it meant building on what you created." I considered his words carefully. "Leadership is not a race," I replied. "It is stewardship." He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. I did not remind him of the day he suggested I was slowing things down. I did not recount the silence in that first meeting after my resignation. There was no need. The lesson had unfolded on its own. In the months that followed, the company continued to grow at a sustainable pace. Investor confidence remained steady. Employees spoke of stability rather than uncertainty. I attended quarterly meetings as a strategic advisor, offering perspective when requested, remaining silent when appropriate. I no longer felt the weight of carrying every decision. That weight had been redistributed, not abandoned. One afternoon, as I left the office building after a review session, I paused in the lobby and looked back at the polished floors, the framed awards, the reception desk where my access card had once failed. I realized something quietly powerful. My value had never been diminished by age. It had simply been underestimated by those eager to prove momentum. By stepping aside, I allowed space for comparison. And in that comparison, clarity emerged. Leadership is not measured by volume or speed. It is revealed in steadiness, in judgment, in the trust that remains when circumstances shift. I did not reclaim the head of the table because I no longer needed to. The room itself had adjusted. The people within it had learned. And sometimes the strongest position is not the one you fight to keep, but the one that remains unmistakable even after you release it.